Power doesn't belong to the loudest man in the room. It belongs to the one who never has to prove he has it. The first thing people noticed inside the Jefferson County Courthouse that Monday morning was not the sound of the judge's gavel or the quiet shuffle of attorneys carrying heavy case files. It was a sharp command that echoed across the marble hallway before the courtroom doors had even fully opened. "Get them on their knees." Officer Ethan Briggs barked, his voice slicing through the uneasy silence as dozens of heads turned at once. Standing beneath the bright fluorescent lights were two tall black men wearing simple charcoal suits, their expressions calm despite the attention fixed upon them. They neither argued nor protested. They simply exchanged a brief glance, the kind shared between people who had spent years trusting one another when words were unnecessary. Briggs mistook that silence for defiance. His jaw tightened as he stepped closer, convinced that everyone watching needed to see who controlled the room. "You heard me," he snapped. "This courthouse isn't your playground." A few spectators instinctively moved aside, while others pulled out their phones before quietly lowering them again after noticing the posted rules against recording inside the building. Lawyers paused mid-conversation. A court clerk froze with a stack of files pressed against her chest. Even the security officers near the entrance seemed uncertain whether to intervene or simply observe. The older of the two men calmly lifted his hands just enough to show he had no intention of resisting. "Officer," he said in a steady voice, "we're here under lawful orders." Briggs let out a short laugh that carried more arrogance than amusement. "Everyone says that." Without waiting for another explanation, he instructed another deputy to place both men in restraints while several people whispered among themselves. Some assumed they must have interrupted an important hearing. Others quietly wondered what they could possibly have done. Neither assumption was correct. The younger man, Isaiah Brooks, briefly looked toward the closed courtroom doors, almost as if he were checking the time, rather than worrying about his own situation. Beside him, Marcus Carter remained remarkably composed, his shoulders relaxed, and his breathing steady, showing none of the panic most people would feel under dozens of suspicious stares. Their composure only irritated Briggs further. To him, confidence for men he had already judged looked like disrespect. "You think you're special?" he asked with a smirk. "You'll learn everybody follows my rules in this building." Marcus answered with the same calm tone. "Rules matter. That's exactly why we're here." The sentence lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. A young law student seated near the gallery frowned, sensing there was something unusual about the exchange. Experienced trial attorney Rebecca Collins quietly studied the two men, noticing details others overlooked. The disciplined posture, the precise way they scanned every exit without appearing nervous, and the unmistakable habit of standing shoulder to shoulder without ever blocking one another's view. They carried themselves like professionals trained to remain calm under pressure, not like men trying to escape accountability. Yet Briggs never noticed any of it. His attention remained fixed on proving a point before the courtroom filled. "Escort them inside," he ordered. "The judge can decide what happens next." As the heavy oak doors slowly opened, sunlight poured through the courthouse windows and stretched across the polished floor like a silent warning no one understood. Somewhere outside, engines rumbled in the distance. Most people dismissed the sound as ordinary downtown traffic. None of them realized that within minutes, the arrival of one unexpected visitor would transform this ordinary courtroom into the center of a reckoning that Officer Ethan Briggs could never have imagined. The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as Marcus Carter and Isaiah Brooks were escorted to the front of the room, every pair of eyes following them with quiet curiosity. The polished wooden benches creaked as spectators leaned forward, eager to understand why two calm, well-dressed men had suddenly become the center of attention. Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered. Through the side door with her usual measured pace, her black robe flowing behind her as everyone rose. She acknowledged the room with a brief nod before taking her seat high above the courtroom floor, immediately noticing the unusual tension lingering in the air. "What is the nature of this interruption?" she asked, her voice firm but controlled. Officer Ethan Briggs stepped forward without hesitation, standing taller than necessary, as though he were presenting an undeniable victory. Your Honor, these two individuals attempted to enter a restricted proceeding and refused to cooperate with courthouse security. I believe they should remain detained until their identities can be fully verified. The judge looked toward Marcus and Isaiah. Neither man appeared frightened, angry, or even frustrated. Instead, they stood with the quiet discipline of men accustomed to waiting patiently, while others reached conclusions too quickly. Judge Whitmore studied their expressions for several seconds before asking a simple question. Gentlemen, do you wish to respond? Marcus answered first, his voice calm enough to lower the emotional temperature of the entire room. Yes, Your Honor. We arrived under official authorization and intended to present ourselves before these proceedings began. We have no intention of disrupting this court. Briggs folded his arms with visible disbelief. That is convenient, he replied before the judge could speak again. Everyone suddenly has official authorization once they are confronted. A few spectators exchanged uncertain glances. The confidence in Briggs's voice contrasted sharply with the restraint shown by the two men standing before him. Isaiah finally spoke, choosing every word carefully. Respectfully, Officer, our documentation should already be available through the proper channels. Briggs responded with a dismissive smile. Then maybe those channels forgot to tell me. Court clerk Melissa Grant quietly searched through the electronic docket on her computer, her fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. After several moments, she frowned, noticing that an encrypted entry attached to the day's schedule remained inaccessible without additional federal credentials. Before she could mention it aloud, Briggs interrupted again. There is nothing mysterious here. They simply do not belong where they were trying to go. Marcus glanced briefly toward the courtroom doors, not with anxiety, but with quiet awareness, almost as though he expected someone to arrive at any moment. His composure puzzled attorney Rebecca Collins even more than before. Years of litigation had taught her to recognize panic, deception, and desperation. She saw none of those qualities in either man. Instead, she noticed habits impossible to fake, the disciplined posture, the patient breathing, and the instinctive awareness of every movement around them without appearing distracted. They carried themselves like professionals whose confidence had been earned through years of responsibility rather than pride. Judge Whitmore sensed the growing uncertainty spreading across the courtroom. Until I receive complete information, she announced, this matter will remain under review. Briggs appeared satisfied, believing the delay strengthened his position. Marcus simply nodded once in acknowledgement. Outside, the low sound of approaching engines became slightly louder, followed by the distant rhythm of synchronized footsteps echoing across the courthouse plaza. Inside the courtroom, no one yet understood why courthouse employees near the front entrance had suddenly stopped what they were doing and turned toward the windows with expressions that shifted from routine attention to unmistakable respect. The quiet murmur inside the courtroom slowly returned as people attempted to convince themselves that everything unfolding before them was ordinary. But the atmosphere had already changed in ways that could not be measured by words alone. Judge Eleanor Whitmore remained seated with her hands folded, watching Officer Ethan Briggs as carefully as she watched Marcus Carter and Isaiah Brooks. Years on the bench had taught her that truth often revealed itself long before evidence officially appeared, usually in the way people carried themselves when no one believed them. Briggs stood with growing confidence, convinced the delay worked in his favor. Marcus and Isaiah stood with something entirely different. It was not confidence born from ego. It was patience, the kind that came from years of discipline and absolute certainty that facts never needed to race ahead of emotion. Court clerk Melissa Grant quietly refreshed the restricted docket once more. The encrypted notation still refused to open, displaying only a federal authorization seal that she had never encountered before. She leaned slightly toward Judge Whitmore and whispered, "Your Honor, there is definitely something attached to today's calendar that requires credentials far above county access." Before the judge could respond, Briggs spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Whatever it is, it has nothing to do with these two. They are simply trying to create confusion. Marcus slowly turned toward him without changing his expression. "Officer Briggs," he said calmly, "we have spent our careers avoiding confusion. That is why we followed every instruction given to us before arriving here today." Briggs shook his head dismissively. "Then your instructions were wrong." Isaiah finally allowed himself a faint smile, not out of amusement, but quiet understanding. Sometimes the difference between being early and being late is only a matter of who has all the information. Several spectators exchanged puzzled looks. The statement sounded less like a defense and more like a certainty. Attorney Rebecca Collins noticed it as well. She leaned toward another lawyer seated beside her and whispered, "Do you realize they have not asked for sympathy once? They have not complained. They have not even tried to defend their reputation." The older attorney nodded thoughtfully. People who know exactly who they are rarely do. The heavy courtroom doors remained closed, yet the faint sound outside continued to grow. It was no longer random city traffic. The rhythm carried unmistakable precision. Courthouse deputies near the entrance instinctively straightened their posture as if responding to years of professional habit. One deputy quietly pressed an earpiece closer, listening to information arriving from courthouse security downstairs. His expression changed. Almost immediately. "There is an official motorcade entering the property," he whispered to another deputy. "Multiple government vehicles." Briggs overheard only part of the conversation and frowned. "Probably another hearing," he muttered, dismissing it without another thought. Marcus briefly looked toward the courtroom windows where morning sunlight reflected across the polished floor in long golden lines. Isaiah followed his glance for only a second before returning his attention to the judge. Neither man appeared surprised by the growing activity outside. Judge Whitmore noticed that detail immediately. She leaned back slightly in her chair, thoughtful now instead of impatient. "Mr. Carter," she asked, her voice quieter than before, "were you expecting additional participants in today's proceedings?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor. We have been expecting them since before sunrise." The courtroom fell silent once again. Briggs laughed under his breath, believing he had just heard another unbelievable excuse. But before anyone could respond, every conversation inside the courthouse stopped at once as the distant sound of synchronized footsteps came to an abrupt halt directly outside the courtroom doors, followed by a respectful silence so complete that even the air inside the room seemed to pause in anticipation of whoever was about to enter. The silence outside the courtroom doors seemed to stretch forever, yet inside Marcus Carter remained as composed as ever, his eyes focused not on Officer Ethan Briggs, but somewhere beyond the walls of the courthouse itself. Isaiah Brooks stood beside him with the same quiet discipline, his expression revealing nothing despite the uncertainty surrounding them. To nearly everyone in the room, they looked like two men waiting for judgment. The truth was far more complicated. Less than 48 hours earlier, before sunrise painted the Atlantic horizon in shades of deep blue and gold, Marcus and Isaiah had stood aboard a United States Navy installation hundreds of miles away. The ocean had been calm that morning, broken only by the steady rhythm of waves against the pier and the distant sound of helicopters lifting into the cool coastal air. Neither man had expected to spend the next 2 days inside a county courthouse. They had arrived at the base for what appeared to be an ordinary briefing, but nothing about the meeting had been ordinary. Inside a secure conference room, senior military officers and federal investigators reviewed documents marked with multiple security classifications. Maps, financial records, sworn statements, and official reports covered the long conference table. The investigation was not about battlefield operations. It was about integrity. Someone had been abusing public authority, manipulating evidence, and using official positions to shield misconduct from public scrutiny. Federal investigators had quietly spent months assembling information while avoiding unnecessary attention. Marcus and Isaiah had been selected because of their professionalism, judgment, and ability to remain calm under extraordinary pressure. Their mission was not to make arrests or confront anyone. It was far simpler and far more important. They were ordered to deliver protected documentation directly to the court, where a federal review would begin under sealed authority. Every instruction emphasized patience, discretion, and absolute respect for civilian law enforcement procedures. They were specifically reminded that no matter what happened, they were not to escalate conflict or reveal confidential information before the authorized officials arrived. Marcus had nodded once after reading the assignment. "Understood," he answered. Isaiah responded with the same quiet confidence. "We complete the mission exactly as instructed." Neither man asked unnecessary questions because both understood that successful operations depended on discipline more than speculation. Back inside the courtroom, Marcus remembered those final words from the briefing as clearly as if they had been spoken only moments earlier. "Stay calm. Protect the process. Let the truth arrive on its own schedule." Officer Briggs interpreted that calm as stubbornness. He could not understand why two men facing public embarrassment remained so remarkably steady. Every minute, they refused to argue. Only strengthened his belief that he had complete control of the situation. Yet, Judge Eleanor Whitmore noticed something entirely different. She had presided over thousands of hearings during her career, and she recognized the unmistakable difference between people hiding the truth and people patiently waiting for it. Melissa Grant quietly refreshed the encrypted court calendar once again. This time, a small notification appeared on her monitor before disappearing almost instantly. She caught only 3 words before the screen returned to its previous display. "Arrival confirmed below." Her heartbeat quickened. She looked toward the courtroom entrance just as the courthouse clock struck the hour. Outside, polished shoes crossed the marble floor with measured precision. Conversations throughout the building faded into respectful silence. Whatever had been approaching since early that morning had finally reached the courtroom, and within seconds, every assumption made inside those walls was about to be tested against the truth. The quiet expectancy that had settled over the courtroom should have encouraged caution, but Officer Ethan Briggs interpreted it as an opportunity to tighten his control over the room. He took another deliberate step forward and looked directly at Marcus Carter before speaking with unmistakable confidence. "Until someone proves otherwise, you will remain exactly where you are." Marcus met his eyes without hostility. "We have no intention of leaving." The answer sounded almost reassuring, yet Briggs heard only quiet resistance. "Good," he replied, "because this hearing is not going anywhere until I know exactly who you are." Judge Eleanor Whitmore watched the exchange carefully. She had expected frustration from both sides by now, yet only one person appeared determined to escalate the situation. Marcus and Isaiah Brooks remained remarkably composed, standing with the same measured posture they had maintained since entering the courthouse. Isaiah glanced briefly toward the courtroom clock. Another minute had passed. He knew the schedule better than anyone else in the room, although he never mentioned it. Melissa Grant continued working through the courthouse records, searching every available database for information connected to the mysterious authorization attached to the day's docket. The encrypted entry remained locked, but another notification appeared beneath it. Instead of displaying names, it showed a simple status update. "Federal escort cleared." Melissa quietly read the words twice before looking toward Judge Whitmore. The judge noticed her expression immediately. "Is there something new?" she asked. Melissa answered carefully, mindful that every word echoed through the silent courtroom. "Your Honor, I still cannot access the protected documents, but additional authorization has just been confirmed." Briggs turned toward the clerk with visible impatience. "Confirmed by whom?" Melissa hesitated. "The system does not identify the sender." Briggs dismissed the answer with a wave of his hand. "Then it does not mean anything." Rebecca Collins quietly observed him from the gallery, becoming increasingly uncomfortable. During 20 years as a trial attorney, she had learned that certainty without evidence often created the greatest mistakes. The two men standing before the bench had never raised their voices, never challenged the authority of the court, and never attempted to justify themselves beyond stating that they had arrived under lawful orders. Everything about their conduct reflected professionalism rather than confrontation. Around the courtroom, whispers slowly returned. Some spectators wondered whether the entire misunderstanding would soon be resolved. Others remained convinced Officer Briggs must know something everyone else did not. Yet each passing minute made that assumption more difficult to accept. Marcus finally spoke again, directing his words toward Judge Whitmore rather than the officer. Your Honor, we understand the responsibility carried by this court. We are prepared to wait as long as necessary for the authorized officials to arrive. His voice carried no impatience, only quiet confidence. Judge Whitmore nodded thoughtfully. Your willingness to cooperate has been noted. Briggs immediately interrupted. Cooperation does not change the facts. Marcus answered gently. That depends on which facts have reached the room. The sentence lingered in the silence that followed. Even Briggs found no immediate reply. Outside the courtroom, courthouse employees could now hear multiple vehicle doors closing in careful sequence. The sounds were followed by measured footsteps approaching through the marble corridor, accompanied by the unmistakable professionalism of an official escort. Deputies stationed near the entrance instinctively straightened their uniforms. One quietly opened his radio before lowering it again after receiving a brief transmission. His expression shifted from routine attention to unmistakable respect. The heavy courtroom doors remained closed for only a few seconds longer, and every person inside unknowingly turned toward them at almost the same moment, sensing that whoever stood on the other side was about to change the course of the entire morning. The moment the heavy courtroom doors opened, every conversation stopped without anyone being asked to remain quiet. For uniformed military escorts entered first with calm, deliberate movements, not hurried, not dramatic, but carrying themselves with the unmistakable discipline that immediately commanded respect. Behind them walked a distinguished naval officer whose presence alone transformed the atmosphere inside the room. His dress uniform displayed decades of honorable service, and every polished detail reflected the highest standards of leadership. Admiral Nathaniel Ross stepped across the courtroom threshold with steady confidence, acknowledging no one until he reached the center aisle. Even before anyone spoke his name, several veterans seated in the gallery instinctively rose to their feet. One retired Marine quietly removed his cap and held it against his chest. The gesture spread through the room almost without thought. Judge Eleanor Whitmore straightened in her chair, recognizing the extraordinary nature of the moment. Officer Ethan Briggs remained frozen for an instant, struggling to understand why such a senior military leader had entered an ordinary county courtroom. His confidence did not disappear, but uncertainty finally found its way into his expression. Admiral Ross stopped several feet from the bench and addressed the judge with measured professionalism. Good morning, Your Honor. I appreciate your patience. I apologize for our delayed arrival. Judge Whitmore inclined her head respectfully. Admiral, this court welcomes you. May I ask the purpose of your appearance? Before answering, Admiral Ross slowly turned toward Marcus Carter and Isaiah Brooks. The courtroom became so quiet that the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed unusually loud. Every eye followed the Admiral as he walked directly toward the two men who had spent the entire morning standing calmly under suspicion. Without hesitation, Admiral Ross came to a precise stop before Marcus. He offered a formal military salute. Marcus immediately returned the salute with the same flawless precision. Isaiah did the same a heartbeat later. No one in the courtroom moved. No one even seemed to breathe. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, yet it completely changed how everyone saw the two men standing at the front of the room. Admiral Ross lowered his hand and spoke with unmistakable respect. Commander Marcus Carter, Senior Chief Isaiah Brooks, thank you for maintaining your professionalism under difficult circumstances. Marcus answered simply, We followed our orders, sir. I expected nothing less, the Admiral replied. Officer Briggs stared in disbelief. His eyes shifted from the insignia on the Admiral's uniform to Marcus and Isaiah, then back again as though hoping he had misunderstood what he had just witnessed. Rebecca Collins quietly closed the notebook she had been holding. The questions that had occupied her mind all morning suddenly disappeared. Melissa Grant looked at her computer screen one final time. The encrypted docket unlocked automatically. Names, authorizations, and federal credentials appeared across the monitor exactly as the Admiral had entered the courtroom. She looked toward Judge Whitmore and whispered, "Your Honor, everything has been verified." The judge carefully reviewed the information before lifting her eyes toward the Admiral once more. "It appears this court has just received the clarification we have been waiting for." Admiral Ross nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Commander Carter and Senior Chief Brooks were acting under direct federal authorization in coordination with this proceeding. Their mission required complete discretion until my arrival. Around the courtroom, expressions of confusion slowly transformed into quiet realization. What many had assumed was an ordinary security incident had never been ordinary at all. It had been the opening chapter of something far larger, and the truth had finally begun to enter the room. Officer Ethan Briggs felt the confidence he had carried throughout the morning begin to slip away, replaced by a silence that no explanation could immediately fill. Only minutes earlier he had believed he understood exactly who stood before him. Now the highest-ranking person in the room had greeted those same two men with unmistakable respect. Judge Eleanor Whitmore reviewed the newly unlocked documents on her monitor with careful attention, taking her time before speaking. Every page carried official federal authorization, verified military credentials, and sealed court approvals that had been inaccessible until Admiral Nathaniel Ross entered the courthouse. She looked up from the screen with an expression that had shifted from uncertainty to complete clarity. The record now reflects that Commander Marcus Carter and Senior Chief Isaiah Brooks were present under lawful authority and in direct coordination with this proceeding. The words settled heavily across the courtroom. Marcus and Isaiah remained exactly as they had been since arriving that morning. They did not celebrate. They did not smile with satisfaction. They simply stood quietly, allowing the truth to speak for itself. Admiral Ross stepped beside the bench and addressed the court with measured professionalism. "Your Honor, this assignment required absolute confidentiality. Commander Carter and Senior Chief Brooks were instructed not to disclose protected information until every authorized official had arrived. They followed those instructions without exception." Judge Whitmore nodded slowly. "Their conduct before this court has reflected that discipline from the beginning." Rebecca Collins quietly exhaled as though a complicated puzzle had finally fallen into place. She realized that the strongest evidence had never been hidden inside classified documents. It had been visible all morning in the calm professionalism of two men who refused to abandon their principles even when others questioned them. Melissa Grant continued reviewing the digital records now visible on her screen. Every timestamp matched. Every authorization had been approved before sunrise. Every document confirmed that Marcus and Isaiah had been expected participants in the federal review scheduled inside her courtroom. She looked toward the judge once again. "Your Honor, there are also sealed investigative exhibits waiting for your authorization." Judge Whitmore acknowledged the notice before directing her attention toward Admiral Ross. "Does the federal task force wish to proceed?" "Yes, Your Honor," he answered. "The court now has everything necessary to begin the review exactly as planned." Briggs finally found his voice. "There has to be some mistake," he said quietly, no longer sounding certain, but genuinely confused. No one informed courthouse security. Admiral Ross turned toward him without anger. "Officer Briggs, classified operations are shared only with personnel whose responsibilities require advanced knowledge. That limitation protected both the investigation and everyone involved." The Admiral spoke calmly, without accusation, yet every word carried undeniable authority. Marcus looked toward Briggs for the first time since the Admiral's arrival. His expression showed neither resentment nor triumph. "We understood that not everyone would know why we were here," he said. "That is why we never resisted your instructions." The courtroom fell silent again. Several spectators lowered their eyes, reconsidering everything they had witnessed since the morning began. What had appeared to be ordinary confidence had actually been disciplined restraint. What had seemed like unanswered questions had been protected information waiting for the proper moment. Judge Whitmore gently closed the first folder of verified documents before reaching for the next. The court will now proceed based upon the facts that have been lawfully established, she announced. As the first sealed exhibit appeared on the courtroom display, everyone present realized that the misunderstanding surrounding Marcus Carter and Isaiah Brooks had never been the true purpose of the day's proceedings. It had only been the moment that revealed who had respected the law when no one else yet understood where the law was leading. Judge Eleanor Whitmore opened the first sealed exhibit with deliberate care, allowing the courtroom monitors to display only the information approved for public review. The atmosphere remained remarkably still, yet the emotional weight inside the room had shifted completely. Earlier that morning, nearly every eye had been fixed on Marcus Carter and Isaiah Brooks with uncertainty. Now, those same eyes turned toward the evidence, appearing one page at a time. Admiral Nathaniel Ross remained standing beside the bench, his posture composed, allowing the judicial process to move forward without interruption. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "the materials before the court represent the result of a coordinated federal investigation conducted over several months. Every document has been independently verified through military and civilian channels." Judge Whitmore acknowledged his statement before reading the summary into the record. Financial reports, official communications, internal policy reviews, and sworn witness statements formed a consistent timeline that pointed toward procedural misconduct unrelated to the two men standing before the court. Marcus and Isaiah had never been the subjects of the investigation. They had been entrusted with protecting the integrity of the evidence until it reached the courtroom exactly as ordered. The realization settled across the gallery with quiet force. Rebecca Collins glanced toward Officer Ethan Briggs, whose expression had changed from certainty to deep reflection. The confidence that had defined his actions earlier in the day had been replaced by the unmistakable recognition that assumptions made too quickly could carry lasting consequences. Melissa Grant continued reviewing the authenticated records as additional federal officials quietly entered the courtroom and took seats reserved for authorized observers. Everything unfolded with remarkable professionalism. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, only the steady movement of lawful procedure. Judge Whitmore looked toward Briggs with the same fairness she had shown everyone throughout the hearing. "Officer Briggs," she said evenly, "this court recognizes the responsibilities carried by courthouse security. Those responsibilities also require careful evaluation before conclusions are reached." Briggs lowered his eyes for a brief moment before answering. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice sounded noticeably quieter than it had earlier that morning. Admiral Ross addressed him with calm professionalism rather than criticism. "Every officer who serves the public faces difficult decisions. Experience teaches us that authority carries its greatest value when it is guided by patience as much as confidence." The words filled the courtroom with thoughtful silence. Marcus finally spoke, not to defend himself, but to acknowledge the larger principle at stake. Respect for the law begins with respect for the people standing before it. That is true for everyone, regardless of appearance, profession, or circumstance. Isaiah nodded in agreement. "Our responsibility today was never about proving who we were. It was about protecting the process until the truth could arrive through the proper channels." Several spectators quietly reflected on those words. The misunderstanding that had dominated the morning now seemed far smaller than the lesson unfolding before them. Judge Whitmore completed her review of the final public exhibit before setting the folder aside. The record clearly establishes that Commander Carter and Senior Chief Brooks acted lawfully and professionally throughout these proceedings. Their conduct reflected complete compliance with the instructions given to them under federal authority. Around the courtroom, the tension that had lingered since the first moments of the hearing finally began to disappear. What remained was something far more lasting than surprise. It was the quiet understanding that justice had not changed because powerful people entered the room. Justice had prevailed because patient people trusted the truth enough to let it speak before they did. The hearing concluded not with celebration, but with quiet dignity, the kind that lingered long after words had faded. Judge Eleanor Whitmore carefully signed the final procedural orders before looking across the courtroom one last time. The record will reflect that the court has completed its review based upon verified evidence and lawful authority. The proceedings have demonstrated the importance of patience, professionalism, and due process. Her gavel came down with a single measured strike that echoed through the chamber, signaling the end of a morning that no one present would soon forget. The spectators slowly began gathering their belongings, yet very few hurried toward the exits. Most remained seated for another moment, reflecting on how quickly first impressions had given way to undeniable truth. Melissa Grant quietly closed the last encrypted file, watching as the federal authorization automatically expired now that the hearing had officially concluded. Rebecca Collins slipped her notebook into her briefcase without adding another word. She had arrived expecting an ordinary day in court. She was leaving with a reminder that experience alone never replaced humility. Admiral Nathaniel Ross walked toward Marcus Carter and Isaiah Brooks with the same calm authority he had displayed since entering the courthouse. "Your assignment is complete," he said. "You protected the process exactly as you were instructed." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Thank you, sir." Isaiah smiled faintly. The truth always arrives eventually. Sometimes it simply takes the longest route. The Admiral returned the smile. "That is why discipline matters. Anyone can remain confident when they are understood. Character is revealed when they are not." Nearby, Officer Ethan Briggs stood quietly, watching the conversation from several feet away. The certainty that had guided his actions earlier that morning had been replaced by thoughtful reflection. After a long pause, he approached Marcus and Isaiah without the confidence that had once filled every step. "Commander Carter," he began carefully, "Senior Chief Brooks, I allowed my assumptions to reach conclusions before the facts did. That should not have happened." Marcus looked at him with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the entire day. "Every profession carries responsibility," he replied. "What matters is what we learn after difficult moments." Briggs nodded slowly. "I intend to remember this one." There was no anger in the exchange, no triumph, and no humiliation. Only a quiet acknowledgement that respect could begin where certainty ended. As the courthouse gradually emptied, warm afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, replacing the sharp morning light that had witnessed so much misunderstanding. Outside, the official vehicles departed as quietly as they had arrived, blending into the ordinary rhythm of the city until nothing remained except the memory of what had taken place inside those walls. A young law student who had watched the entire hearing paused before leaving and looked back toward the now empty courtroom. She realized that the most important lesson of the day had never appeared in any exhibit or official document. It had been demonstrated by two men who refused to surrender their composure when others questioned their worth, and by a legal system that ultimately allowed verified facts to overcome assumption. Long after the courthouse doors closed behind the final visitor, one simple truth remained stronger than every misunderstanding that had come before it. A badge may represent authority, a uniform may represent service, and a courtroom may represent justice. But none of them can fulfill their purpose unless every person is first judged by the truth instead of appearances. Because real justice never asks who someone seems to be before deciding who they truly are.